Thank you so much, Professor, for your responding remarks. Is it work? Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Especially for emphasizing on the education as a vehicle or as a pathway for the reform, and on the values as the axis for those reforms. Now I would like to give a floor for analyst, Dr. Isham Pawan Ahmad, who is an associate professor and is teaching philosophy and theology at the same university as our previous speaker does. It's International Islamic University of Malaysia. And I think it would be worth mentioning that Dr. Isham Prof. Ebrahim Musa, I remember at one of your lectures, you mentioned that at the beginning of times, you dreamt of being an engineer or a person who is going to deal with the various kind of devices. I think they are somehow taking revenge at you right now, that you chosen the other path. So what is worth mentioning about Dr. Isham is that he obtained his master's degree at the University of Chicago under the late Professor Fazlur Rahman, and his PhD also from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland.
Assalamu alaikum. Don't worry, I'm not going to have a very long lecture. I had to stand up because I'm using the slides rather than the Now, I would like to thank Professor Ibrahim Musa. His last part actually begins my first part. His icon on Jerusalem reminds me of the situation here. The icon answered, I was doing my job. We have here when the riot police were chasing people who were demonstrating, they were saying, yang menurut perintah, which is, I was only following orders. So, and actually almost every letter that the government official writes, at the end will say, I was only following orders. So does that mean that we don't think just because we become a government officer? I guess so. So, and therefore we lose responsibility. In other words, the banality of evil becomes somewhat possible, even though these people are actually very nice, if you know them personally. But when they're running orders, they're following orders. Now, on Prof. Tahir's interesting lecture also, this question whether Islam is actually relevant anymore, or is it that other forces become more relevant in people's lives, that they are actually not guided by an Islamic idea, but actually guided by other things. So let's see, what have we done that this becomes now possible in actually somewhat Muslim societies? I'm not going to address, I mean, the issue of tradition is important, but I think that tradition has changed so much today. We have actually narrowed tradition. Our understanding of Islam or Islamic tradition has become so narrow, we have actually become quite circular. These are Islamic issues, these are not. And so what becomes relevant? I have this, what I'm trying to argue is, I think Prof. Farouk, when he started this Islamic Renaissance Front, has a very different version of Islam from actually the general public. Like it or not, we have actually an Islam, two different versions of Islam. Islam against Islam, in a way. So the Farouk version, or the general version, to a lot of people seems to be this very narrow, very ritualistic Islam, where everything functions in this manner, and other than this, anything goes. But we have a more inclusive form of Islam. As Fazlur Rahman, my late professor, was arguing, actually, it's far more inclusive than you think. And so I'm trying to argue today that how this has happened, and why it has happened, and actually the challenge actually is to try to, the reform is not reform just in reform which hadith to use, but the reform of which tradition to use, but actually expanding the understanding of Islam to be a very inclusive religion. Yeah, I think we keep losing out to the tradition, because mainly actually the modern or the reformist Islam is actually quite difficult. It's easy to resort to Islam, which you just go to the mosque, come back from the mosque, go do certain other ritualistic things. But when you start saying that you should live your whole life, and starting to say your property belongs also, your property, your wealth, your responsibility towards others in society is actually quite strong, it's difficult. You would prefer the other religion where you just go on Friday and therefore talk to a few people and they tell you go to the mosque, take this, and you're fine. But actually when you look at the Quran and the struggle of the Prophet, it was a lot more than that. So let's see what has happened. So I read this quotation from Ali Shariati. I know it's controversial, but it started off a discussion within me, and it brought this idea. As the recent Malaysian issue, somebody started to raise this issue, said, when the Islamization reforms happened during Mahathir's period and even before that, is it good? What's the position of the political parties on this Islamization? Should we just turn it around? Or should we actually continue? Many somehow come to see religion as negative, not positive. That's the strange thing. You would have thought that if the idea of as people become more religious, they become more compassionate, they become more tolerant, they become more concerned, and corruption should actually go away, because the argument that even though you might get away with it here, you won't get away with it in the next life. But no, it's not that case. In fact, the opposite happens. People become more intolerant. People now interfere in private lives. Corruption does not go away. And surprisingly say, well, corruption is actually not a religious issue. All of a sudden, as they reduce this, right, as a religion is a basic phenomena which plays contradictory roles. Right? In life as a human being, it destroys, revitalizes, puts to sleep, and awakens, enslaves and emancipates, teaches docility, and also reward. Whether you want the Marx answer, religion is an opium of the masses to keep them quiet, tell them that, well, the next life's a lot better, don't interfere with what's happening today. Or you can have revolts, or the idea that you use religion in order to get a group of people to go against another group of people. So the history of Islam itself is a story of contradictory roles of religion among various social classes. You have the elites trying religion as a way to domesticate or make people docile, obedient. Or you have actually, when the Prophet first began Islam, when Islam first comes out, the early people to actually join Islam is actually the downtrodden, the poor, the oppressed. And that's why the Quran keeps talking so much about the relationship between helping the poor and Salah, or the prayer. So as the early verses, Meccan verses even use the word, what's the point of your prayer if your prayer does not lead you to help the poor and the others? So this idea, how come we have lost this? That's the issue. This relationship between Islam and actually tolerance, concern for the downtrodden, and for the poor has been somehow, this message disappeared somewhere. All of a sudden, the message has become either LGBT, in Malaysian context, sometimes murtad has become a major issue, but the economic responsibility or concern and care for your brother disappears. And everything, that will be socialistic. That's not religion. So is it true? So let's see. As Shariati also continues to argue, like the history of war it is the history of war of Islam against Islam. That even between the war between the Quran and the Quran, different versions of people's understanding of these two things now actually seems to struggle within the society. Now, as it is true that always and everywhere logical and progressive Islam and the Islam of movement, motion and movement has been actually outmaneuvered, defeated by the deviant and sometimes decadent version of Islam. I was always thinking about this, and I found out, why do we always lose out? Why not the more progressive Islam wins? But you find that actually progressive Islam is actually very hard to live up to the progressive idea of Islam. Is actually very difficult. To live up to the ritualistic version of Islam is actually very comforting, very easy, relatively very easy. Go to the mosque, come back from the mosque, anything in between that, you can do anything you want. So that probably be the, how do we now actually tell them that Islam is not just going to the mosque? So it is truly enlightened, a truly enlightened and realistic person knows that the only way to maneuver is to eradicate it from its mind, from the mind of people. So now actually it becomes this polishing as we teach a certain version of Islam. And it's dominated from the primary school all the way to the secondary school, all the way to the university. So ritualistic Islam, which actually doesn't interfere with anything else. So what we have here is to substitute substitute true Islam instead of the life-giving and primordial Islam that we should be inculcating. Ali Shariati says, how do we do this? Question is, it's always easy to say, this is what should be done. But what you have actually is the majority arguing the total opposite. So what do you do? That I don't have the answers to that. I'm going to have to leave it to you. So at this juncture, we see neither the intellectual who do not know Islam, nor the pseudo-religious people who are unaware of their own time can fulfill our immediate needs. Only trying to find an enlightened intellectual, well, that's easier said than done. So although Prof. Tahir raised the issues of individuals that make changes, but individuals live within a society. And we actually, although we may be quite progressive in our way of thinking, but once you go out to society, you somehow have to dumb it down and conform to what they think Islam is. And it's very difficult to try to actually change them. So what we have, narrowing Islam to trivial issues. The Malaysian one is famous, especially during close to election season. Everything becomes the Americans used to say, the silly season, right? So all of a sudden now, what's the latest one? I got an SMS from Jakim. Oh, make sure you don't send chain letters, or you don't transmit chain letters, because what? That's saying that something will happen to you, because supposedly chain letters say something will happen to you if you don't send this letter on. Oh, that would be against the idea of God giving qada and qadar. You're actually, why is Jakim even concerned about chain letters now? Tell me that. Whereas you have, of course, the laundromat issue became such a big issue. I don't know how it died down, actually. It's still going on certain level, as certain shops refuse laundromats refuse to take clothes from non-Muslims. And it's amazing that we have it. Supposedly, Malaysia is quite a modern society. It seems very contradictory. Its modern outlook, at the same time, a very, very strange understanding of religion, especially during close to election season. So, how do we change it? For example, as I went to discuss human rights, was a human rights lecture or actually a conference, every single lecturer after me were condemning human rights. Why? Because it will promote LGBT and it will allow murtad. So either every Muslim wants to leave the religion or every Muslim wants to become LGBT if they were allowed to do so. That's your understanding of religion? This is pathetic and sad. Right? So how these are tied up, and therefore the argument the government must now control everything. so that this does not happen, because these are Aqidah issues. However, on the contrary, at the same time corruption is ignored, it's not a religious issue. Everybody is corrupt. Corruption is a human issue. It's not a religious issue. So what we understand as religious issues have been narrowed down. Once you narrow this down, you can do anything. So early verses, as I said, the Quran always talks about helping the poor against corruption, and therefore economics actually is, if you read Fazl Rahman quite well, many of his articles or his writings have to do with economics, with not Islamic economics. Very different with Islamic economics and ethical economics. So that's a different thing. As the Quran has tied the ideas of one God to one humanity, it's kind of strange to start saying, oh, we believe in one God, but at the same time, we believe that God created everything, so didn't he create all men equal? Yet, you seem to be able to differentiate between Muslims and non-Muslims. Discrimination is actually noble. In this country, when we're discussing Islamic ethics, and I said discrimination is wrong, I said, why not? What's the problem? We have the power, we are in power, so we can discriminate. You may have the power to do so, but you may not have the right to do so. And you would contradict your idea of God being just, and God is the creator of all men and women, sorry. So, human rights were seen as negative, not positive. Unlike the American Constitution, which argues all these rights are natural, God-given rights, we also actually have the idea of hukukullah wa hukukul ibad, with the rights of man and the rights of God. But all of a sudden, when it deals with human rights, no, they don't have these rights. So how do we narrow it down? That's the issue. We have secularized Islam. Why? How? That's the causes. I actually got this from Omar Talib. He helped me out. So, yes. The causes, he argues the causes are multifaceted. Problems, actually, you will find it not only in the classical texts, where you have the promotion of certain theological ideas because certain governments promoted the idea, but you have actually the sources problem lies in our institutions, whether it's the government, religious scholars, and even schools. Although I would go much more than this, but as I said, I didn't want to a system of justice and equality is kept in place by how his potential answer, let's see, we'll discuss it, but he gives, my friend gave this answer, reduce the size of government, reduce the power of government, reduce the law. He's very anti-government, so. Now, problem of religious, actually I'm more interested in the problem of religious scholars than actually government. I'm actually, the problems of religious scholars is that most of them raise a number of trivial issues and actually ignore serious issues that's happening. That's why, you know, strangely now, you actually don't consult unless you are dying or need to be buried or birth. Everything in between, you actually don't consult a religious scholar. So either it's when you get a child, or you need to have a burial ceremony, then you call a religious scholar. But anything in between, whether what kind of job, what you should study, what you should do, you probably ask someone else. So what have we done? That the religion, as Tahir probably said, right? These people who went for these ISIS missions actually have little to, not actually motivated by religion, but probably motivated by something else. But the question is, why has religion become so irrelevant to our society? As I would argue, actually, in many cases, because we have dumbed down and narrowed the understanding of what religion is, this is what has happened. Now, the question of how to change this, I don't know. So, you have trivial issues, including the length of someone's beard. That was Omar's. And how many times you can say talaq, as of course is now discussed in the Indian parliament. Amazing, Indian parliament discussing whether you can do the 3 times talaq or not. Now, real issues such as lack of human rights, abuse of the poor by the rich, denial of movement of labor and wealth, corruption in government, spousal abuse, all these which are actually affect people's lives, are relevant to everyone's lives, become irrelevant issues to the ulama. How is it possible it becomes like this? So tell me, how are they going to look when we discuss reform, Islamic reform, that the ulama in themselves have become somewhat irrelevant? The debate has become, they have been left behind, that they no longer discuss serious issues. So in Malaysia, for instance, inflation is a very serious issue. Prices that go, food prices have gone up. People have a hard time finding a job. Do you see any mufti talking about this? No. Why not? I mean, when the GST was first raised, when the government taxes were raised, there were some that were arguing, some voices said you can't tax the poor. But it was never taken seriously. Neither was it followed through. So I don't see, well, I don't understand. As the ulama starts to argue, we have become less and less relevant to the society, less and less influential. The issues that they pick and choose have actually become less and less relevant. It's emotional, yes. It's fun, actually. Watching laundromats not allowed, it's fun. It's ridiculous. But it's irrelevant. So to most large parts of society, they have somehow made themselves irrelevant. As I said, challenge to any scholar that's not brave enough to speak truth to power, which they don't do, which very, very rarely occurs. Shame them publicly, this is my friend's answer, shame them publicly and denounce them, which will never happen. Cowards should not be allowed to control our mosque and preach Friday sermons, which is also his answer. But as I attended the Friday sermon just yesterday, that was the guy talking about it. So thank you very much.